Welcome to HTML and CSS series. We'll be covering topics about the HTML and CSS, how to use them in modern browsers, web applications, and such. Definitely starting out as a web developer, we do recommend that you learn HTML and CSS first before moving on to the more advanced topics. Let's go inside of the overview of this series in general and see what we're going to be covering. So the first part will be explaining HTML and CSS basics. So first question, if you want to become a web developer, where do you start? What to learn first? So we briefly talked about it at the beginning. We strongly recommend that you start with HTML and CSS. They're pretty easy to learn, and you can cover a lot of ground with just these two programming languages. What is HTML and why is so important? So let's talk a little bit about this. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It is a programming language that web browsers can understand and read. HTML tags or elements is how web browser understands what needs to be rendered to a page and what each section represent. And we'll see more examples once we start getting inside of the actual coding and showing you the pages. But some of the usual elements that you can find in an HTML page are images, links, lists, text, and so on. So HTML is easy to learn and works on every browser and device. If, for example, the code of the specific web application is written in PHP, JavaScript, or any other languages, output that is basically displayed in the web browser, almost I would say 90% of the time is displayed and rendered back as HTML. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. And let's put it this way, if HTML is building web page blocks, then CSS is what makes web pages look good. Declaring styles with CSS work together with HTML really good. There's a couple of CSS terminology and pretty basic way of understanding how CSS works with HTML is that we can link it to the HTML in order for them to work. And there is so-called external CSS, which we link to the HTML page. We'll see in later examples. There's internal, which means that the CSS can be declared inside of the HTML page, or inline CSS. Inline CSS means that we can use CSS properties inside of the HTML tags. This is outdated and old kind of way of doing CSS. We don't recommend this using, but it's up to you at the end of the day. We're going to be covering HTML box model. We'll be talking about that, what that means, what it stands for. Also CSS positioning, so how specific elements on the page are positioned and how they relate to each other. Then we're going to be covering CSS grid system. And then been talking a little bit about using classes versus ID. And then CSS reset and normalize libraries that we can include in our project in order for to speed up the development process and also to fix some of the browser issues. We'll be showing you tools and best practices, how to get around and how to understand what's actually outputted to the page. Moving along, the next section will be advanced HTML and CSS. We'll be covering, for example, CSS selectors. Some of them are sibling selectors, pseudo elements and classes. We'll be seeing, what they stand for, how we can use them. The next topic and pretty important one is the CSS media queries. So here is where we're going to be using CSS to control different screen size and how our HTML elements are behaving on the page, depending if the user is viewing them in the desktop browser, laptop, mobile, or tablet. We're going to be then drilling deeper into the responsive web, how we're going to be using HTML and CSS. Then a mobile first methodology is the idea of building a website from the mobile view and then upwards, meaning that we're going to be looking inside of our responsive web pages and then seeing how we're going to make them work for every device. Then advanced topic in regards to the CSS will be use of the SAS and SCSS. Then CSS frameworks, responsive grid, and finally CSS Flexbox.